got an email the other day proudly announcing to me that Diamond Mine Baseball had just released the 1919 season. This is the first deadball era release Diamond Mine Baseball has ever come out with. I was excited about this. In fact, I was so excited I dropped the project that I was working on, bought the season, and decided to look directly at the 1919 season instead. When most of us think about 1919, we naturally think about the Black Sox, and for good reason. But you know, we tend to forget that the Black Sox scandal didn't break until the end of the 1920 season. So if you were going to go back to the end of 1919, you would notice that baseball fans were talking about something different. For example, 1919 was the year that the ban on Sunday baseball in New York City was finally lifted. Babe Ruth hit his first career grand slam that May. By mid-August, Ruth had 17 home runs, which was a new American League record. Ruth finished the season with 29 home runs, a new record, 2 more than the old 1884 mark of 27. Eddie Seacott of the White Sox won 29 games. Walter Johnson of the Senators wound up with a 1.49 ERA, and Ty Cobb of the Tigers managed to hit an amazing 384. But what was the craziest part of 1919? Well, that was probably the fact that most people didn't think there would ever be a 1919 Major League Baseball season. The 1918 season had been cut short due to the war effort and had proven to be quite unpopular. Some newspapers printed that people were simply not interested in the sport anymore, not anymore now that America was at war. Famously, the players in the 1918 World Series were given a lump sum of money at the end of the series, setting things up for a possible fix. The Detroit Free Press predicted that baseball might never come back again. And in a sort of tribute to what some considered a doomed game, Ty Cobb and George Sisler both pitched a few innings in the same game at the end of the 1918 season. Little did they realize that the Boston Red Sox would go nearly a century before winning another World Series after 1918. So this season that everybody was going to forget wound up living a long time in taunts and jeers. I guess it goes to show you that not everything you read in the papers is true. The war was gone but not forgotten. In January 1919, the baseball owners decided to run a 140-game schedule. It seems funny to us today, but you've got to remember that baseball had used 140-game schedules in the recent past, in fact, as recently as 1903. Though some claim that the owners were concerned about the public not being interested anymore in the national game, it seems that the true reason for a shortened schedule was to try to cut down on travel expenses. This was important in the face of rumors of an increase in the war tax. Okay, let's talk about this war tax. This was a tax on all entertainment, anything that was deemed a luxury. It was set at 10%. The war was over now, but people were talking about raising that tax to 20%, believe it or not, and still calling it the war tax. An increase in a war tax after the war was over. The war tax continued all season long in 1919, even reaching down to the minor leagues and all semi-pro and amateur teams that charged money for tickets. That war tax, by the way, was listed on the World Series tickets themselves. There were complaints about college football teams being exempt from the war tax, since the proceeds from those games were theoretically spent on education. Writers complained about the baseball war tax. Now, as late as 1924, there were still stories and articles about getting rid of this war tax. I think that it finally ended in 1925, though honestly, I'm not quite sure. It's kind of hard to do research on the war tax. Most modern articles and studies on domestic taxation in the early 1920s tend to focus on income tax, not this war tax on luxuries. There were also stories about kicking out players who served in industry rather than serving directly in the military. Well, fortunately that didn't happen, and of course when you sit down to think about it, it's totally ridiculous. I think this was just another example of a man trying to turn himself into a hero at the expense of somebody else. Anyway, I decided to push Diamond Mine Baseball through an automatic season replay with lineups and transactions all turned on. I then did the same thing with OOTP in 1919, same setup. I thought we could compare the two. Alright, let's start off by looking at the aggregate stats. In 1919, the American League had a .268 aggregate batting average, a .333 on-base percentage, and a .359 slugging percentage. There were 240 home runs and an average of 4.10 runs per game. In Diamond Mine, we had a 266 batting average, a 330 on base percentage, and a 357 slugging percentage. Incredibly close in my opinion. Runs scored, however, was a bit high. There were about 500 more than in real life. In the National League, offense was down in real life. We had a 258 batting average, 311 on base percentage, and a 337 slugging percentage with only 3.65 runs per game. Diamond Mine did well here. The average was at 261, on base percentage was right on at 211, and slugging percentage was a bit hot at 345. However, we still saw about 500 runs more than we should have. Now, OOTP is really annoying and wouldn't show me average numbers for each individual league, so we have to look at the average for the major leagues together. The overall 262 batting average was very close to the 263 batting average in real life. The 318 on base percentage was 4 points low, and the 346 slugging percentage was 2 points low. This, of course, is very close. Now, pitching is where we start to see major problems. In real life, there was a 3.22 ERA in the American League. In Diamond Mine, however, the ERA in the American League was up to 3.60, a pretty significant difference. Note that there were a total of 644 complete games in real life in 1919. Diamond Mine's American League was a bit low, coming in with 556. That's about 100 off the pace, and it's significant because we played the exact as-played schedule. Meanwhile, the National League had a 2.91 ERA in real life and 657 complete games. The National League pitchers in Diamond Mine had a 3.08 ERA, again, way too high. And there were 572 complete games in the National League, still just about 100 off the pace. OOTP gave us a composite ERA of 3.31, which was also high. The overall ERA between both leagues in 1919 was 3.07. Meanwhile, OOTP gave us a total of 1,436 complete games. This time, almost 150 more than the 1,301 total complete games in real life. Yeah, those differences are pretty significant. I mean, the hitting rate stats were on, but the ERAs were off, far off. That tells me that both games have difficulty replicating dead ball era fielding. Also, the complete game totals were way off, which tells me that you really have to manage the games yourself. Anyway, enough of the statistical mumbo jumbo. Let's go take a look at what happened in the pennant races. In other words, the fun stuff. In Diamond Mine, the Reds entered the beginning of September with a big lead. Meanwhile, the American League was up for grabs. By September 21st, the Reds had clinched and the White Sox were close to clinching. In the end, the White Sox won by a game and a half, and we had a Cincinnati-Chicago World Series just like in real life. Meanwhile, in OOTP, it was the White Sox with a sizable lead over Cleveland. The Reds, meanwhile, were battling it out with the Giants. New York struggled in a 5-game series at the Boston Braves, leading me to think that the Reds might pull it out after all. However, the Reds couldn't quite play well enough to fend off John McGraw. In the end, the Giants won the pennant by a game, setting up a repeat of the 1917 World Series. Now, you'll notice in both replays that the American League teams didn't play the same number of games. That's because I used the as-played schedule for both replays. Yes, this is another example of why you really should use the as-scheduled schedule and make your own lineups as you go. That helps you get rid of this problem of having an uneven number of games played. The Reds won the World Series in Diamond Mine by a 5-2 margin. Game 2 was the only really close game, and Cincinnati came very close to a comeback. Meanwhile, the OOTP World Series went the distance, with the White Sox winning in the 9th game at home. The White Sox came from behind to win this one in dramatic fashion. Well, I guess that this means that there was no fix in the OOTP world, right? Anyway, there you have it. Both games played somewhat similarly when push comes to shove. There were problems with earned runs being too high in both game engines, and the computer manager really couldn't figure out what to do with the pitchers. In the end, for these videos, I kind of prefer OOTP. Why? Because I can use it to show you highlights of the games themselves. With Diamond Mine Baseball, you can't even go back and retrieve the play-by-play in a game that you played by hand. However, when it comes to actually playing the games out, I still find Diamond Mine Baseball more fun and more engaging for the user. But what do you think? Do you think that one set of results was more realistic than the other?